This is a production of Cornell University.
Actually, I should go back a little further, as you'll soon hear while I'm talking, that Alan and I pronounce about the same way, which gives an indication that I'm also a Canuck that has moved south, not as far south as he, but I went through the University of Guelph on my undergraduate, then came south here to Cornell for master's and PhD, and eventually came back 1979 to join the faculty here, so I've stuck around ever since. But it's a fun journey, and I'm going to be pulling up stakes at the end of September, so it's been fun being part of this. But today I want to share with you my latest love, and that is high tunnels, cut flowers, and things along those lines. So if all these gadgets work, the topics I want to cover, and I'll hit the first ones in fairly rapid order, is what are high tunnels. I know our audience is diverse, so we need to go into a little detail there. Then focus in on New York State, what are high tunnels used for here in the state. Then we'll switch over to cut flowers, again, assuming that some of you may not be all that informed about that topic. You heard the about. Worldwide, cut flowers are not necessarily coming from our local areas, but then within US and again locally New York, we want to know about that. And then we'll combine the two major topics into high tunnels and cut flowers and how we might use those structures together. First of all, we need a definition, and this is a fairly loose one. It's an unheated plastic covered greenhouse, can be made out of metal or most likely is, or sometimes wood, etc. The heat is provided by the sun, so those of you in sunnier locations will have a better time with these structures than those that are not. And you do need to provide water since the plastic sheds the water off. The US and New York State are quite slow in taking on this technology. It probably started originally when plastic film was discovered in the 1960s or so. The Asians have taken this to a tremendous degree, as you can see from the acreages involved, 2.5 million acres. Those of you that have traveled to China recently, you travel through the countryside on their super roads, and you look out the side window and you see these valleys. You can't see soil. It's all just plastic after plastic after plastic, and it's mostly tunnels that might be as high as 2 feet or so. This is a picture, I think that's Bill Miller's.
I think that's my hand.
Yeah. But that's, you know, the whole valley, the whole valley is covered with plastic, and they're growing vegetables primarily in there. They've also innovated. They're using the sun as a heat storage device, or using the structure as a heat storage device. And these special tunnels in the middle picture there have a north wall that is made out of brick or earth or something like that. And the sun comes up and beams in there, warms that up, and at night it radiates the heat back. So you don't need to heat the place. But you do need sunny winter conditions, which in New York State is a bit of a challenge, of course. So it might not work here. Or if you fly over the Mediterranean, southern Spain, Italy, Turkey, Greece, North Africa, into Egypt, Tunisia, etc., all along the Mediterranean, there's tunnels all over the place. And this is Almeria, Spain, the picture on the right. It's again, the plastic is covering everything. So tunnels where it's at, and tunnels in other countries are much more popular and much more pervasive than here. 350,000 acres in the Mediterranean. You know, that's a lot of plastic. That's a lot of area covered. Okay, so let's come closer to home. I'm sorry I didn't put in pictures of gigantic tunnels and multi-structures and so on, but just to give you an idea that we've got quite a few of these structures around these days. It's estimated between 500 and 600 farms here in New York State have some kind of protective structures, most of which would be high tunnels of various sizes and shapes. So they are becoming much more popular here as well. So why are they becoming popular here? Well, part of it is a cost factor. As you can see in the table, for a 30 by 96 foot structure, a high tunnel will cost you about $3.25 per square foot. If you move it, it costs more. If you don't want to be growing in the soil there, you want to move it to another place, then it has to be more rigid. You need the rails, etc. So it costs more. By the time you get to greenhouses, we're up at $5, $6, $7, $8 per square foot. So it's a cheap alternative to grow stuff in. This information I got from the Rimmel catalog. The other major factor that's been given a big boost to high tunnels and high tunnel production is the USDA. The NRCS has had for years, and it's still continuing, in each of the states, a program by which they will give financial aid for construction of a new tunnel. And if you don't want a 30 by 72 foot one, you can get a 30 by 96 or larger size, but they will only pay for that portion of it. But that's been a quite handy boost for people who are kind of on the fence and say, yeah, we could really use one, but I can't afford it. Well, here's the way you can. So NRCS offices around the state can help you with the applications for that. And so what is, as I've already mentioned, we've had quite an increase in high tunnels in New York State with, at this point, it's about a $6 million production value being grown in these structures. So what sorts of things are being grown? Well, we've heard about tomatoes earlier today, and that's the huge #1 crop that is very well adapted to tomato production. And if you're familiar with tomato production in greenhouses, the production in high tunnels is quite similar. It gives the advantage, just having that sun assist, of having a growing season that with a harvest from mid-late June all the way into October. There's high quality because the rain is kept off. All these nasty diseases that Marjorie mentioned are not altogether gone, but certainly much less problem because you've got a dry environment in there. And you're applying water not to the foliage, but just to the ground. Okay. And, 15 pounds per plant, pretty good. And a lot of people have figured that out, and a lot of people are doing it. And you talk to growers and say, yeah, I'd never produce a tomato outside anymore. I can get 5 times as much yield from the high tunnel tomatoes. Okay, so that's such a popular crop that once you have a high tunnel, you say, why would I grow anything else? It makes me so much money. But then you get into Marjorie's problems again. You say, oh, well, okay, botrytis is coming in, this disease, that disease, insects that have gotten adapted to that situation, and so we've got problems of succession. You really should be growing something else in that space to break up the problems that are going to happen. One way you can do that is put in greens that can even go over winter and be harvested in early spring. Some of these salad greens are quite cold hardy. You can freeze them stiff, and next they'll come back out of it and can be harvested, and they're delicious. But not too many people know about komatsuma and somini and sensasa. And so there is a bit of a consumer education project that someone needs to undertake to take more advantage of these very productive crops. Cucumbers, colored peppers, they're all good, but economically more questionable. They aren't as productive as tomato. Right? You can produce a good quality crop, but So in terms of selecting vegetables for this high tunnel environment, there are some principles you need to follow. Well, first of all, what can you sell? Then you need some, if you're going to use the fall through spring season, you need crops that are adapted to that. And in hot weather, okay, tomatoes do pretty well as long as you've got good ventilation, but you might investigate, okay, I'm near an urban area, we've got a lot of people from Latin America, they're really interested in vegetable X or vegetable Y, or the Asian folks and so on. So adapting to what can be sold out of some of the more tropical materials could be quite lucrative. The longer you can keep the crop in the ground and keep harvesting, the more attractive it should be, because you've got a consumer base that is used to getting that material from you or a grocery store, and you should be able to make out better that way. And then, of course, you can utilize the space by something climbing, but you can also hang stuff from the top. So I'll show you an example of that, some work that Neil has done on that. Raspberries. Raspberries don't like to get rained on, and raspberries can be extremely productive in a high tunnel environment. Those of you that are coming this afternoon to see our cut flower trials over on Maple Avenue will see high tunnel with blackberries and also with the fall bearing raspberries that start bearing in about 2 weeks or so, and will keep on going through October. Who has raspberries in October in New York State? Hardly anybody. But those raspberries, you give them to a consumer and they can keep them for a whole week. They don't melt down because they've been protected, so the diseases don't get into the fruit. So that's a very lucrative crop. And it's a perennial, so you don't have to plant it every year. So something to consider. Blackberries, same sort of thing. Very productive, huge berries. In fact, I can show you those this afternoon. That's work by Dr. Marvin Pritz and his assistants. Okay, so bedding plants, your area. And luckily, Neil Matson has done a bunch of work on that. Started in our tunnel over on Maple Avenue, but has worked with growers on this, and a ton of information. He gave me 75 slides. I elected not to use them. But he's sitting right down here, so if you want to know about that, just talk to him. And the bottom line that he essentially, after all the work that he's done on it, is don't use them on cold sensitive crops. But it's for bedding plants, finishing the bedding plants before they're going into your centers. The high tunnel can be quite useful. But you have to choose wisely which crops you're going to do this with. If it could frost in early spring, mid-spring, and you've got coleus in there, forget it. It's gone. And so you have to be rather careful on which ones you do this with. It's also, if you have a crop that you're going to be shipping to a particular, or you're trying to hit Mother's Day, some years we get a real cold spring, and no amount of tunnel protection without the sun shining is going to get you that crop to flower before Mother's Day arrives. And so that's a bit of a risky thing. So not having that deadline can help. And you can use low tunnels, and of course we don't have a high tunnel police that comes around and says, you said you have a high tunnel. You don't. You're putting supplementary heat. You're not allowed to do that. There's no such thing. If you want to put a heater in there and keep things protected, you certainly can. And so there is flexibility there, and in some situations it might make a lot of sense to have a supplementary heater for those cold periods to bring things along. And it would still be a lot cheaper than constructing a greenhouse with all the bells and whistles that go with that. Okay, so here's some data that Neil shared for one of the years in 2011. He had a number of different bedding plant species that he put in there in April, And the flower date in the greenhouses, so he had these parallel experiments, one in the greenhouse and one in the high tunnel. And you can make the comparison. The greenhouse Angelonia flowered on May 3rd. The high tunnel, well, sorry, didn't quite make it because they did have frost events. But if you go to Dianthus, May 21 in the greenhouse, May 29 in the high tunnel, not too bad. Geranium, almost the same time. Lobelia a bit late, and so on down the list. So it comes back to the point I was making earlier. Okay, so choose the species you might do quite well. Neil did a set of experiments with Judd Reed. Judson Reed is our high tunnel greenhouse specialist for the state of New York, more or less. He's over in Penyan, but is available for advice for other parts of the state, of course, as well. And so they were putting, I think, petunia, right, in hanging baskets above a tomato crop, and and they had a
They were scouted weekly, and we started from seeds.
Oh, are we having a problem here?
TMV-free crop.
TM-free, of course. Yes, of course. TMV-free. Indeed. It's just an example. You could put other hanging basket type stuff in there. Yeah. So anyway, the bottom line on this one is both crops came through fine. None of them were diseased, and the yield of the tomato was not affected by the hanging baskets.
Is it a lot warmer at the top? So you could
yes, it is warmer in the top. Yeah, during the day. At night, the temperature is pretty much the same. Yeah. Okay, so now we're going into cut flowers. You remember I was going to talk about cut flowers. Well, okay, here are the cut flowers. About 15 years ago, if you went to a place to get cut flowers, you probably couldn't get much in the way of cut flowers in a grocery store or a supermarket, but you had to go to a florist, right? And what flowers could you get? Well, roses, sure, no problem. And chrysanthemums, yep, any time of the year, no sweat. Carnations, yes, and so on. And that was pretty much it, except in the spring you could get some tulips and lilies and so on. But domestic production was pretty much minimal. Advanced to more recent times, and we still have the florists and even the grocery stores, or now even much more of the grocery stores, selling those 4 cut flower species any time of the year. Very reliable, good varieties, Life, yeah, not too bad. But those are almost all coming from here in this country, from South America. If you're living in Europe, then it's coming more from Africa. But domestic production is really very, very minimal. But we've come a long way since then, and people have started to demand flowers locally. We want something different. We'd like to try something else. And as a result of that, that has generated a very large industry that is producing crops like tulips, gerberas, lilies, gladioli, irises, etc., etc., etc. Okay? So the industry has changed vastly over the last few years. The South American production, mums on the left, I don't know what's on bottom right. Interestingly enough, they're growing them in high tunnels, but in upland valleys where the temperature is the same all year round, the day length is the same, and they keep on producing, and the labor's cheap, and the flowers are flown overnight to Miami and then distributed all over the country. So, you know, what's not to like about that? It's very reliable, and us consumers here like that pretty well as well. But, you know, we have gotten into the cut flower deal here in the States, and we can see the kind of species that are being grown and their production values in the table here. And you know, it's pretty substantial, but it's still, the big four are still the dominant flowers, and we're never going to do away with that, and that's fine. You know, if you want to get married in February, you're not going to go to your local or to your local producer of flowers and say, hey, where are my tulips or roses? We don't have them. So that's always going to be. But we do have this very substantial production now of cut flowers that is produced in the States or even more locally. So to give you a little taste of where and what, large scale production of flowers still is primarily in western United States. Back 100 years ago, it was Long Island, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, etc. And then it migrated out west because it's easier to grow stuff out there. And now it's in specialized places where the climate is ideal, so that things like hydrangea, you have these cool mornings in Oregon. Every morning is cool and cloudy, and hydrangea loves that. It grows like fantastic. Or the calla lilies on the right also seem to like that kind of climate. But it's diversified much more than that. The picture up at the top there, Fresh Tulips USA, it's a gigantic greenhouse in Virginia that produces tulips about 9 months of the year. And it's industrial production. They bring the tulips in from the bulbs in from Holland, sometimes a year. Other times a year it's coming from Chile, and they put them in their storage rooms and give whatever cold treatments needed, and then they bring them out into these greenhouses. There's no soil; it's all just in crates, and some of them are hydroponic, some of them are in some kind of special mix, and they're producing millions of stems that are distributed, and you get them in your supermarkets. You know, $6 for a dozen, and nobody can compete with that. And like them, it's very nice. So that's an example of the sort of thing. The other one is not exactly a cut flower production area, but the Swan Island dahlias is primarily a propagation of dahlias, but they have so many varieties, and they do sell some cuts from there as well. What do we got? Then parts of California, again, have just the ideal climate for one species or another, and you see large-scale outdoor production with very successful. But with the problems that they're having with water these days, who knows? It might not last that much, although this can compete with some of the other things like alfalfa that they're growing with that precious water. This would be a more lucrative crop, I would think. Okay, so let's get back to New York State. We do have some large-scale producers. In fact, within an hour's drive of here, we've got some quite substantial peony producers up in the Geneva area that produce peony cut stems and send them down to New York, Washington, etc. Also on Long Island, the industry is coming back to some extent, larger scale, again because the proximity of consumers down in that part of the state, dahlias, cleome, etc., etc. So quite a bit of production coming back. But what's more prevalent to, and perhaps more familiar to you all, is the small-scale producer that has cut flowers as a part of a larger, maybe vegetable operation, or someone that's just doing a few hundred square feet or a few acres of cut flowers that they then locally take to the farmers market or to grocery stores, etc. And the nice thing about this whole trade is that it is such a vast number of species that are potentially used for cut flowers or cut stems or cut foliage, woodies, etc., etc. And we're very privileged to have the authors of the Bible of this kind of work with us in the audience. You heard from one already, the man with the abouts, and the second one is Judy Lauschman, who's sitting in the back here, the executive director of an organization I'm going to mention a little later on. So they wrote the book. There are 83 species in there, a vast variety, and there have been others discovered, quote unquote, since then, so the list is even longer. But that's part of the fun of working in cut flowers, is that you say, hey, we could use that for cuts maybe. So just some scenes from local producers in their beds of zinnias, oftentimes part of a tour where we're going to visit them and see what they were doing. So our production locally then is local, seasonal, many species. It avoids the big four because we can't compete really very well with that. And the emphasis is on quality. And it's also, these species don't ship very well oftentimes, but fine, you put a bouquet together, you take it home, you put it in a vase, you at least should have it for a week. Okay. And then what did they do with them? Well, I've already mentioned it to some extent. Farmers markets, probably the largest outlet. Supermarkets, weddings, roadside stands to some extent, working with restaurants on bouquet, or other businesses that value fresh flowers that have a subscription service. And then finally we get into the high tunnel as a place to grow these things. And they're very suitable. The high tunnel structure is well suited for producing high quality flowers because you can grow a lot in a small space. The tunnels themselves are a valuable real estate, so the more you can pack in there, the better. And if you choose a species that can be harvested over a period of time, it allows you to have quite a nice income. So an extended growing season because you're protecting against frost in the spring, you're protecting against cold weather in the fall, you're protecting against wind, which allows the plants to grow taller and straighter, and you have the disease reduced because of the drier environment inside. And the high tunnel environment is so near that of a greenhouse that you can use all the tricks that John Sanderson would tell us about in terms of natural enemies to keep things like aphid, thrips, white flies, etc. under control. So it does allow us quite a bit of control methods that outside in the field we're not able to use. Now, it isn't all rosy, and I would paint a wrong picture if I didn't mention also this quite personal picture on the left. One does get snow events, and one does need to be ready for it. In that particular time, we weren't ready. We disregarded the manufacturer's warning, don't keep the cover on over winter, and we'd gotten away with it for 2 or 3 years, and then I got a phone call from the farm manager on my birthday, February 26th. He said, Chris, I've got some bad news for you. Yeah? What? Oh, your tunnel collapsed. That's this over here. And there are places in this world where high winds can occur. This is Long Island Experiment Station, yeah? Where if you don't have your plastic really pinned down well, you can end up with shreds of plastic all over the place. And so high winds can be a problem and do require special construction techniques. We have not since not had a problem. We've kept the plastic on our high tunnel for the last, that was 2010, so the last 5 years, without any problem, even though we did have snow. And the trick is to anticipate the snowfall event and have a salamander heater inside the structure to keep it warm enough so that the snow slides off instead of depositing itself. Well, this has a peak, but wasn't enough of a peak, and then it was a wet, heavy snow that collapsed it down in that regard. So, but there are ways to get around that. Okay, so what kind of things? I already mentioned we need stuff of high value. We want a long harvest season. We want them early as possible, and we want high quality of the tunnel. So the crop over the top, well, let me just go through. High value, okay, so how much money can you make? And we like to compete against the tomato growers, so we say, okay, let's just put some of these figures together, and a graduate student in Wenfei Uva, who some of you I'm sure know, put together this economic analysis that took into consideration the cost of building the structure as well as what the income could be from that. And turned out that Lisianthus gave you an income of $2 per square foot. It's just not too bad. A couple of years, you got that tunnel paid for, more than. Sunflowers, just a single crop of sunflowers, only gave you 14 cents. Well, you wouldn't just grow a single crop of sunflowers, you'd put in more stuff. So, and then the tomatoes come in sort of in between, depending on the size and the cost of the structure, $1.40 down to 60 cents or so. And then cukes by themselves, just a single crop of cukes, forget it, don't ever. You're losing money. Okay. Okay, so what kind of stuff do we grow in there? Well, some people try, foolishly myself, tried to see, okay, can we really do tulips? And I will say that tulips have a nice strong stem and are much nicer than the ones you get in the grocery store, but nevertheless, you're competing with a flood, and it's really hard unless you've got something very special. The other one that has turned out to be quite interesting for us is anemone and ranunculus. And it uses the dead time in the high tunnel. We plant the bulbs in mid-December in the tunnel. And we are finished harvesting by late May, June. And they produce beautiful stems and gorgeous colors. So that's a really serious one that uses a time of the year that otherwise the tunnel is not really very productive for. So that's one really to watch. Other spring crops, more traditionally early season planted, so larkspur or sweet peas, campanula medium, that just look wonderful, but they won't be out until about June or so out of the tunnel. Spring planted snapdragon works pretty well. Godetia, stock, again, are spring crops that would be of interest. Mentioned Lisianthus already. It has a beautiful, elegant flower, and there's lots of different varieties, different colors, look enough like roses. They don't have the scent of roses, not that modern roses have much of a scent anyway, but this is a very productive and lucrative crop, as I mentioned already. Zinnias, dahlias, again snaps, are things that grow quite well in tunnels and have a high quality. Celosia, amaranth, they're really tropical, so they love the warmth of the tunnel and get enormous size if you let them. Lots of different varieties, even the ropey one that Alan was showing us earlier. And then extending the season into the fall, you can get a fall zinnia crop and keep it protected against the cooler conditions. The snapdragon crop also does quite well in the fall. What we've normally done is more recently is say, okay, sometimes our snapdragons overwinter for us in the garden. So what about the protected structure of a high tunnel? Can't we keep that over winter? So we've done some experiments over the last 2 years where we're sowing the crop in June or July, transplanting into the tunnel, getting a fall crop off, but then instead of yanking it out, we just protect it with a low tunnel, come back in the spring, and harvest again. So getting 20 to even 30 stems per plant on a 9 by 9 inch spacing is pretty good. And those of you that are coming this afternoon to see our work at Maple Avenue in the tunnel will have a chance to see the crop that's more than a year old now. And it's gotten to be a pest, actually. It's invasive, Mark? And then the other things that don't necessarily have to be in a tunnel situation, but ornamental kale, ornamental cabbage, the varieties that grow tall, can make a nice crop. The picture on the left is from Vancouver area in British Columbia. How many? I'm just like 3 slides away. Okay, so we've got all these species, we've got all this stuff, we know all these things, some of us and others. They want to get into cut flowers, but where are they going to get the information? Well, cut flower growers are not so numerous yet that you can ask Cooperative Extension of New York State about growing this or that or the other thing. Well, luckily, we have an organization which covers that area tremendously well. And again, I'm privileged to announce, to let you know, that 2 of the founders of this organization are here in your audience. Again, Dr. Armitage, before he got on to other things, he was a founder and his graduate student, and then is the executive director of the Association of Cut Flower Growers, Judy Lushman back here, and she has information and literature. If you're interested in getting into cut flowers, I strongly urge you to talk to her and get that information. The ASCFG also has a wonderful website with lots of information. Their quarterly magazine is certainly worth reading. Annual meetings are occurring in different parts. We had it on Long Island, what was it, 6-7 years ago? And regional meetings have occurred here in Ithaca, but also are scattered around. The next one is in Virginia, 3rd week of September, if some of you would be interested. There's a listserv where you can ask a question. Oh gosh, I'm having trouble with this dahlia variety. Can you tell me what might be wrong? And so somebody else writes back and say, oh yeah, I had some same problem last year. This is what you need to do about it, and things like that. Very useful. Then there's a national coordinated variety trial, primarily of annual species, but also into perennials and woody species that the growers themselves participate in and provide the information. And the website I've already mentioned. And to let you know, this is the hottest information just produced. You know, there's a grow local movement and there's a do local and local. This is the membership numbers of the ASCFG since 2009. And if you don't think that local is real, just look at that. Okay? And it's going up. So
When most organizations are going down.
yeah, most organizations are going down. This one is climbing. Right? And it's growers helping each other, sharing information, enjoying what they're doing. And the membership is what? 70% female? I think, probably. And most of them are, oh, the family's left, so what am I going to do? I really love flowers. I'd like to do something. Let me get into this. That's where you see that. Okay. And then other information. We've done some stuff. Others, as I've mentioned already, Judd Reed, Neil Matson, etc. There are high tunnel websites. We have a high tunnel website here as well, of course. The work we've done on cut flowers is in the Horticulture Wien research page. Every year of research that we've done is on there. And then there's books like the Bible I mentioned earlier, and The Flower Farmer by Lynn Baczynski is also quite a useful piece of information. And that's all the time I have, and thank you for your attention.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.